Good morning, everyone. Honorable Senators and Members of Parliament, members of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada, members of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, advocates, community members, and special guests. Aigerim Seitenova. I got that right. On behalf of myself and my co-hosts, the Honorable Senators Ravalia and Senator McPhedran, welcome to this parliamentary seminary on the public health imperatives of nuclear disarmament. In 1945, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the first use of nuclear weapons for warfare. Over 200,000 lives were lost. The lives of those who survived were permanently changed. Burns, radiation sickness, cancers, heart disease, and just some of the burdens that survivors continue to carry to this day. As a physician myself, I can only imagine the distress that healthcare workers must have felt then and continue to feel as they responded to the never-ending masses of injured men, women, and children. This is why, in the years that followed, the medical community became unified in its stance to prevent future nuclear catastrophes, to prevent what cannot be cured. Today, more than 13,000 nuclear weapons remain, with over 2,000 nuclear tests conducted. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons remains unsigned here in Canada. This is unacceptable. The use of nuclear weapons is a global public health issue. Let me repeat that. The use of nuclear weapons is a global public health issue with potential for worldwide famine, climate disruption, and loss of human life. Today, we recognize those whose lives have been impacted by nuclear conflict, and we vow to create a safer and healthier future, free from nuclear weapons. How do we do that? Well, stay tuned for the discussions here today. Thank you all for your advocacy and for your leadership. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moodie. I'm Senator Marilou McPhedran, and I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Please, MP Barron, please join us. Hi. We've got seats close up here, please. En tant que sénatrice du Manitoba, je reconnais que je vis sur le territoire du traité 1, le territoire traditionnel des Anishinaabe, des Cris, des Ojibwe, des Dakota et des Nez, et la patrie de la nation métisse. Je tiens à souligner que le Parlement du Canada est situé sur un territoire algonquin, Anishinaabe, non cédé et non restitué. Je tiens également à souligner que de nombreuses personnes de partout sur l'île de la Tortue se joignent à nous aujourd'hui, qu'elles soient situées sur des terres cédées ou non cédées. I'd like to summarize in English what I just said, which is I come from Manitoba, which is Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I also acknowledged that the Parliament of Canada is situated on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the First Nations of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe peoples. And it is my great pleasure on November 26th to be able to be here with you in person and online for a seminar where experts have flown in to share their knowledge with us. Very grateful to the Senate of Canada for the resources that allow us to record this important seminar, and particularly grateful to my colleagues from the House of Commons and the Senate, the co-chairs for this session, doctors and Senators Ravalia and Moodie. Without their willingness to step forward, we would not have been able to bring this gathering together. And I think that what we're able to do here together this morning has a great deal to do with understanding from experts, from physicians and others with expertise in this area who truly understand the state of the risk for the world. And we know that there's a certain degree of, shall we say, psychological resistance to wanting to be able to face what is quite clearly before us. And this is a chance for us to gain more information about not only the past and not only the present, but also options for the future. And I want to welcome representatives from the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and the branch from Canada as well. To my left is the chair of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War for Canada, Dr. John Guilfoyle, who will be moderating the discussion as we go on. And we also have with us from the international, the IPPNW, Dr. Ira Helfand, the keeper of the Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to IPPNW in 1985. And I think it's important to note that it's from IPPNW that the ICAN, the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, grew to become a recipient also of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, and then to also acknowledge that this year, a partner of IPPNW, the Advocacy from Japan, who are survivors of the atomic weapons used against Japan in World War II, have now received this year's Nobel Peace Prize. So this is a movement not only of very concerned and well-informed activism, but it is also a movement that connects continents and people around the world with a whole range of experiences that make this probably one of the most common shared themes of concern that are operating in our world today. So at this point, I would like to turn this over to Dr. John Guilfoyle, and who will in turn introduce our first speaker, Dr. Helfand.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator. And thank you really for the privilege and honor of being here this morning and getting the opportunity to share with you a diagnosis. And a diagnosis is something that as a physician, we offer with both great care and with great concern, both for the impact of the diagnosis and the treatment that is being proposed and is to be thought upon and is to be embarked upon by all of us, because this diagnosis affects us all. In terms of this diagnosis, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Ira Helfand, who has been a staunch and relentless advocate for preventing nuclear war and promoting disarmament. He will help us understand the implications of this existential threat. Dr. Helfand.
Good morning, everyone. My job this morning is to remind us about what is at stake, what is going to happen if these weapons are used. And I think we need to understand that as long as these weapons exist, it's not really a question of whether they will be used, but simply a question of when. And so we really do need to understand what is going to happen. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either the Russian Federation or the United States. But from material that is available in open source and from conversations with people who've been involved in these decisions, it is clear that major cities, places like New York, Moscow, London, Toronto, Montreal, are targeted with perhaps anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 nuclear warheads each. And each of these weapons will be in the range of 100 to 800 kilotons of nuclear explosive. That is to say, 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. It is very difficult to describe all of these explosions going off all at once. And so I'm going to use the model of a single very large explosion, a 20 megaton, 20 million ton bomb. The megatonnage, the explosive force in this model is somewhat greater than we expect would be used against any large city. The destruction I'm going to describe is actually an underestimate because you cause more damage with modern targeting strategies using many smaller weapons than one large bomb. Within a thousandth of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball will form, reaching out for 3 kilometers in every direction, 6 kilometers across. Within this entire area, everything will be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, people, the upper level of the earth itself will disappear. To a distance of 6 kilometers in every direction, the explosion will generate winds greater than 1,000 kilometers per hour. To a distance of 9 kilometers in every direction, the heat will be so intense that automobiles will melt. And to a distance of 16 kilometers in every direction, the heat will still be so intense that everything flammable will burn. Wood, paper, cloth, plastic, gasoline, heating oil, it will all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour will coalesce into a firestorm, 50 kilometers across. Within this entire area, the temperature will rise to 800 degrees centigrade. All of the oxygen will be consumed, and every living thing will die. In the case of New York, 12 to 15 million people. Toronto, about 6 to 7 million people. And if this is part of a large-scale war between the United States and NATO on the one side and Russia on the other, this kind of destruction will occur at every major city in the United States, in Russia, in Europe, in Canada. All told, perhaps 200 to 300 million people dead in an afternoon. Those who survive will be living in a world which we cannot imagine. There will be no electric grid. There'll be no cell phones. There'll be no internet. There'll be no public health system. There'll be no food distribution system. There'll be no ATMs. There'll be no public law and order. And the vast majority of people who survive the initial wave of attacks will also die in the months that follow from starvation, from radiation sickness, from epidemic disease, from exposure. So far, I have just been talking about the people living in the countries which fight this war, but it will be a disaster for the entire planet because all of these firestorms will put enormous amounts of soot, some 150 million tons, into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the entire planet, an average of 10 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of North America, like here in Ottawa, and in the interior regions of Eurasia, temperatures will drop 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. We have not seen conditions on this planet that cold in 18,000 years, since the coldest moment of the last ice age. And under these conditions, all of the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of that ice age will collapse. Food production across the planet will stop. And the vast majority of the human race, some 6 billion people, will starve to death in the first 2 years after this war. The study which came up with that figure stopped at 2 years. The famine will not, it will continue. We don't know how many people will ultimately be killed by this famine. It is possible that the human race will become extinct. That same study that looked at global famine from large-scale nuclear war also considered what would happen if there was a more limited nuclear war, as might take place between India and Pakistan. And it found that there too, the effects would be catastrophic. A war between these two countries could kill 100 million people in South Asia in the first week. And it could also cause worldwide climate disruption, not quite as severe as in a war between the United States and Russia, but bad enough to trigger a famine that would kill 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity in the first 2 years, including 130 million people in the United States where I live, and more than half the population here in Canada. What I've just described is not the plot of a movie. This is the danger which we allow to continue to exist every day that we allow nuclear weapons to continue to exist. And we have to understand this. It is almost impossible for us to comprehend a disaster of this magnitude. We may know the data, but we sort of can't believe it. And that's what has to change. As Senator McPhedran pointed out, the danger is sitting there in front of us, and we are ignoring it. And we can no longer afford to do that. We must understand that unless we get rid of these nuclear weapons, sooner or later, what I have described is going to happen. But it doesn't have to, because these weapons are under our control. We can get rid of them. We need to make the decision to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Helfand. Yes, this is the most dreadful symptom of what is the underlying condition, which is humanity's commitment to use violence to solve conflict. Violence to solve conflict is maladaptive, increasingly maladaptive in an increasingly interdependent world. So I believe we are going to have our next speaker, if our Zoom link works. Are we good for this?
Yes.
We're good? Okay. I'd like to introduce one of the most senior politicians in the country, Dr. Hedy Fry, who has been in public service for decades. She's been elected 10 times for Vancouver Centre. She is, I believe, the longest serving female politician in the history of Canada. So I would very much like to welcome Dr. Hedy Fry.
My understanding is that Dr. Fry was with us until a few seconds ago, and that there's been a technical difficulty on her end. So what they've asked us to do, our technical folks have asked us to please bring on our next speaker. Perfect. And then we'll work on bringing Dr. Fry back online. I'd like to welcome the leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May, who's with us. And as well as I asked you to sit closer to us, Lisa Marie, but I didn't introduce you. So Member of Parliament Lisa Marie Barron and Member of Parliament Dr. Helena Jacek, who will be speaking in the program a little later on.
Now, are you going to introduce?
Yes, Nancy, if you could join us at the speaker's chair, and we'll keep our fingers crossed that we're okay. Not yet. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. There are many wonderful advantages to having online and in-person participation, and we're seeing one of them now. Thank you for your flexibility, Dr. Covington, and please join us for your remarks.
Thank you for this opportunity. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, reminds us the only sure way to eliminate the threat posed by nuclear weapons is to eliminate the weapons themselves. The world could barely deal with a COVID pandemic, let alone something as Ira has described to us vividly. Our work is urgent. I wish to evoke a memory of a similar gathering as we have today, only it took place 17 years ago under Stephen Harper's government in one of the splendidly ornate rooms in Centre Block with about a dozen parliamentarians. A Canadian Hiroshima survivor, an advocate for disarmament, Setsuko Thurlow, was center stage and vividly described her escape through the ruins of her school in Hiroshima, where many of her classmates had died. Her rescuer told her, "See the light coming through that opening. Crawl towards it as quickly as you can." These words stick with peace activists. Member of Parliament Alexa McDonough then introduced the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. ICAN at that moment was only 1 month old, and Canada was the very first in Parliament in the whole world to embrace it. But then we lost leadership. Alexa was sadly overtaken by Alzheimer's and was unaware that ICAN obtained its original goal of a nuclear ban treaty, and she was unaware that Suzuko had become co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize given to ICAN for creating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear War. We are hoping that today's event might just reignite some of that Canadian leadership and excitement in the disarmament movement. Now, Alexa's shoes may be huge to fill, but some things stay the same. Prime Minister Kim Campbell stated, working for nuclear disarmament is not a right-left issue, it's a smart, dumb issue. In other words, nonpartisan. Another stable thing are the multiple polls of Canadians, which consistently show that the large majority of us want nuclear weapons abolished. Canada made a start. We got rid of the last of American nuclear weapons deployed on our soil in 1974. A new Canadian leader might create groups to examine stumbling blocks of the TPNW, such as the so-called complementarity issues between the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the TPNW. A new leader might encourage widespread discussion aimed at alternate security methods. For example, common security in place of NATO's supreme guarantee of security by nuclear weapons. Legal experts tell us that belonging to both NATO and TPNW is legitimate. Something about Canada having joined NATO prior to its being a nuclear group. I don't understand this legalese, but I do understand that a single glitch in NATO's electronics could release a nuclear bomb. Another form of a ban treaty could be explored too, if that was more acceptable to the nuclear have nations. Of course, revising the present treaty might be the most straightforward way to go, and sending an official, an observer, Canadian observer, to the third meeting of states parties to the TPNW in March of 2025 would be extremely wise. There are troublesome emerging links between nuclear weapons and the production of nuclear power, which many people view would help the climate crisis, but that is a discussion for another day. In summary, Canada was the first country to introduce ICAN to its parliament. Canadians have traditionally been leaders in peace. We need the return of Canadian leadership. The opening is there for you, whoever that may be.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nancy. Nancy is a retired, but not retiring, family physician from Nova Scotia, with a background in physics as an undergraduate. So she knows her radiation and ionizing radiation and all the challenges that nuclear weapons pose. So our next speaker is going to be, and you will notice we have got a panel, and it's quick and hopefully useful little snippets of information, because all of this fits together. What Nancy was talking about, the importance of the total prohibition on nuclear weapons, is absolutely critical. It's a bit like smoking. There was a time when doctors smoked on war grounds. We had no idea of how dangerous this was. The same is true, really, of the radiation that the nuclear weapons are the most obvious exponent of. But with nuclear technology, we have exposed ourselves to real challenges, which we have difficulty managing. And the most important one we have to manage so urgently are weapons. But there are lots of other issues, but that's for another day. But more importantly, I'd like to introduce Leah Holla. Leah was a high school student when she met Mary Wynne Ashford, Dr. Mary Wynne Ashford, who many will know, at a high school educational opportunity for young people to understand the impact of the nuclear threat and the importance of peace and disarmament. And this galvanized Leah to become a fearless advocate and worker on behalf of this, to the point she has dedicated her young life to this point. She is our executive director of IPPNW, doing an incredible job. She has grown, and she is now somebody who has got a breadth of both experience and knowledge at a very young age on this whole subject. So I would like you to welcome Leah Hall.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, John. And thank you, honorable guests, members of parliament, senators, particularly Senator Ravalia and Senator Moodie and Senator McPhedran for hosting this important event. In 2021, on International Women's Day in the United States, for the first time in history, there was a fleet of all-female nuclear missileers, the folks who press the button to launch nuclear weapons. Now, women too can destroy the world. The inclusion of women in perpetuating, maintaining, and reinforcing an existential threat such as nuclear weapons does not protect women or advance feminist foreign policy. The dangers posed by nuclear weapons, from uranium mining to testing to actual use to the disposal of nuclear waste, disproportionately impacts women, and particularly in terms of their health and well-being. Ionizing radiation is harmful to living cells and is a health hazard at every stage of nuclear weapons life. While this public health threat affects everyone, the risk is disproportionately greater for both women and girls. Studies from Hiroshima and Nagasaki from atomic bomb survivors revealed that women face nearly double the risk of developing and dying from solid cancers due to ionizing radiation. Females also suffer from fertility loss, spontaneous abortions, miscarriages, and potential heritable mutations. As demonstrated by biologist Mary Olson, radiation is more harmful to females and males at any age, but particularly for young girls. They're particularly vulnerable. When children are exposed, their smaller bodies absorb larger doses of radiation relative to their size. And since children's DNA is rapidly dividing as they grow, radiation damage during cell division is more likely to lead to long-term harm. Further, current regulations for permissible doses of regulations or safe doses are based on a reference man, the physiological standard by which the current medical and scientific outcomes are measured against. He's described as being 20 to 30 years old, Western European, and a Caucasian male, about 5'7". Radiation based on reference man typically systematically underreports the radiation for harm for the global population. Additionally, male dose receptors are customarily used to be assigned resulting in radiation cause for women to be routinely underreported. In order to actualize feminist foreign policy, it's not just about women being in control of nuclear weapons, but but policy must address the specific impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls. And in order to do this, we must work towards prevention of that harm through the reduction of threat of nuclear weapons and the complete abolition. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the first piece of international law on nuclear disarmament that incorporates a feminist perspective. It recognizes the disproportionate impacts of nuclear weapons on women and girls, and obliges states to provide victim assistance and environmental remediation to individuals under their areas of jurisdiction. As Ira outlined, the nuclear conflict risk is greater than it's ever been in history, and today's youth, as well as future generations, will be the ones who face the consequences of current inaction. As a responsible state with a feminist foreign policy, Canada is well positioned to take leadership on nuclear disarmament through action and joining international treaties like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Canada can take leadership in safeguarding global health, protecting the most vulnerable, and advancing the well-being of women and youth to help build a safer world for future generations. Thank you, leaders, for being here today. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for engaging with nuclear disarmament.
Thank you so much, Leah. So thank you for the passion, thank you for the content, thank you for being here and really embodying the challenges and the way that we must approach this. And we need everybody, and it has to start. And starting at high school is, you know, this is what you get when you start at high school. And this is so important. So I would like to move on, with your permission, to exactly. And joining us by Zoom all the way from Kazakhstan is Aigerim, if I'm getting that right, Seitenova. Am I saying that right, Aigerim?
It's Aigerim, but almost
Aigerim.
right.
A very great pleasure to meet you virtually. So she's joining us from Kazakhstan, and she's a young nuclear justice advocate, and she's a decolonial feminist with a human rights law background. And her research and activism focuses on nuclear colonialism, transitional justice, civil society resistance movements, and community building. Aigerim, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, John. Dear distinguished members of parliament, senators, physicians, and dear guests, it is my great honor to be here today and to speak on behalf of nuclear frontline community from Kazakhstan. Before I start, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this event, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada, for inviting me to share the horrifying nuclear legacy of my country and hopefully seed the thought of why nuclear weapons do not bring peace but destruction. For me, two words, nuclear weapons, do not sound abstract. And it's not a part of my international relations vocabulary on nuclear deterrence. For me and my family, it constitutes something very real because people in my region I call home were guinea pigs of the nuclear experiment. I was born in the town called Semey, which was formerly known as Semipalatinsk, 120 kilometers from where the Soviet Union had its nuclear test site. For 40 years, the Soviet leadership tested more than 400 nuclear weapons. So let this number sink in for a moment. 400 nuclear weapons. These 40 years have left unimaginable scars on our land, our ecosystem, and environment. Nuclear tests have left horrifying impacts on human health, leaving more than 1.5 million people with various health conditions, if not in the first, then in the second or third generations. I would also like to point out that for 40 years, most of the local population lived in ignorance of what was being done on their sacred land to their bodies, to their families and children. And in this case, the ignorance was far from being a bliss, but rather a curse that was forcefully implanted by the dominant and hegemonic power, the colonial Soviet Union, which used unity of all peoples at the core of its ideology, but still utilized people at the margins for the nuclear experiment, which served as bona fide to the common goal in the nuclear arms race, which resulted in this hemorrhaging wound, which we now call our nuclear legacy. I also know that nuclear testing and uranium mining disproportionately affected indigenous peoples have impacted the health in communities and the environment, including the Dene Nation of Canada. Advocating for a world free from nuclear weapons and seeking nuclear justice and redress is not only about raising awareness for us nuclear frontline communities, it is much about reflecting on our nuclear legacy, on the intergenerational trauma. For many years, speaking about nuclear testing and legacy and harm caused to us was a taboo to share that children were born with disabilities and or genetic conditions, a taboo to share the fear of the unknown for women carrying fetuses and getting pregnant, a taboo to demand adequate reparations from those responsible for this harm and unbearable suffering. An American feminist and activist, Audre Lorde, in her book Sisters Outsider, rethinks on the question of silence in her life, and how the silence never protected her, and that a person might not feel whole if they remain silent because one little piece inside of you wants to be spoken out. It's important to not ignore that part, ensure the transformation of silence into language and action, an act of revelation, of self-revelation. And my self-revelation comes mostly from the silence in my family related to nuclear legacy, since the topic has been not discussed in every household, including mine. And today, among senators in the Parliament of Canada, I decided to share the impact that nuclear testing has had on my family and on me. And this decision comes as a result of my engagement with nuclear frontline communities. My grandfather passed away from lung cancer at 52 years old in 1963. He was a worker who was responsible for the repairment of rail tracks since the World War II. And as many of you might know, from 1949 until 1962, there were the most atmospheric and air tests in the world, and he passed away in 1963. My grandmother passed away in 65 after having mental health issues, and ionizing radiation impacts mental health a lot. My uncle committed suicide when he was 45 years old. My grandfather passed away from liver cancer in his 70s. My mother has a genetic disorder that resulted in autoimmune condition, which passed on to me. And at the age of 3, I almost passed away from the cardiovascular system problems. The visibility I chose today makes me vulnerable, but in my vulnerability, I find strength. In my strength, I find resilience. And in my resilience, I find solidarity with nuclear frontline communities around the world. And I also would like to finish with 2 last thoughts of resistance and coalition against multiple oppressions. And I would like to say that these 2 ideas were developed by Maria Lugones, one of the decolonial thinkers. Oppressions are multiple, but neither separate nor separable in thought or in the world. And this is how nuclear frontline communities, organizations like IPPNW Canada and ICAN, and also governments like Kazakhstan, Kiribati are doing by advancing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and namely working on Article 6 and 7 on victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation. So I call Canada to also follow the steps of these governments to help and assist victims of nuclear tests. The struggle for a world free from nuclear weapons feels like crawling towards a light that at times seems unreachable. This light has been dimmed by the mere creation of the atomic bomb, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and hundreds of nuclear tests. And as a 3rd-generation survivor of the Soviet nuclear testing in my hometown, I cannot help but wonder how we all define peace in a world with nuclear weapons. And sitting in the rooms with hundreds of diplomats speaking about nuclear weapons made me reflect on how we as human beings are responsible for maintaining peace in this world. And in these reflections, there is no place for nuclear weapons. And I stand firm on this. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Aigerim. Thank you.
It was so compelling, the way in which you helped us understand not only what's happening within your family, but the impact on the entire country. And I want to recognize the leadership of Kazakhstan on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, both as a chair of the 3rd meeting of the state parties that is scheduled for March 3rd in New York at UN headquarters. But I think that it's not enough to recognize what governments and diplomats are doing, as important as that is. It's the kind of leadership that you and your colleagues from civil society are bringing that infuses the heart and soul into the movement that is so important. So thank you very much for taking the time today. And speaking of taking time, I'd like to recognize that Member of Parliament Heather McPhedran has been able to join us. So, and we also have a number of parliamentarians that have joined us online. As some may know, it's very bad weather this morning, and also parliamentarians typically have to choose between 4 to 5 things at the same time. So those that have chosen this seminar, we are truly appreciative of that. Dr. Guilfoyle.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator McPhedran. I'd like to introduce somebody who has traveled quite a distance to come to see us. We have Florian Eblenkamp from Geneva. He is the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons Advocacy Officer. And you will learn exactly what an advocacy officer does, as Florian will explain to us exactly his role, his perspectives, and the importance of the issue for which he really spends his every day. Florian.
Thank you so much, John. And on behalf of ICAN, I would also like to thank Dr. Ravalia, Dr. Moodie, and Dr. Senator McPhedran for organizing this event and bringing us together. And of course, the attending members of Parliament. Of course, we also very much appreciate the busy schedules of your days. Often when we organize such panels in different parliaments, the response by the government would be something like, well, this is all very interesting and actually deeply worrying and in too much detail to comprehend, but you really have to look at the geopolitical reality on the ground. So that's what I'm going to do. Just take the last week. The president of the Russian Federation, Putin, has signed into law a new nuclear weapons doctrine, widening the scenarios in which Russia would consider a nuclear strike. Russia has fired a new intermediate range missile at Ukraine. Israel's prime minister and former defense minister are warranted for war crimes, and the country is no longer shielding its nuclear weapons in secrecy. North Korea has received substantial technological support to build more intercontinental missiles. Further, we read about Iran getting ever closer to a nuclear weapons program. We see South Korea arguing for nuclear weapons on their own territory in the name of deterrence. We see more powerful nuclear weapons being stationed across Europe, including in the UK. We see Belarus has become a nuclear host state. At the same time, arms control treaties are in shambles, either not being extended or being ripped apart. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, Canada's so-called cornerstone of nuclear disarmament, is utterly dysfunctional. In August this year, the review conference failed to even adopt a chair's summary, let alone any substantial decisions. And Canada's response to all of this is nothing. Despite all this, the Canadian government sticks to the talking points from the last decade. Of course, there are statements how concerning the situation is, but in the very same statement, the foreign minister would vow its loyalty to nuclear deterrence. And my point is that promoting deterrence, despite all these developments, has brought us into this mess. It's a theory built on the foundation of threats to commit mass murder against civilians. And these threats can only be credible if the nuclear arsenals are constantly modernized, nuclear war is practiced, and implicit threats to use these nuclear weapons are sustained. In other words, holding on to nuclear deterrence will by definition always create an arms race and incentivize proliferation. Looking at the geopolitical reality on the ground, we now see the result of that development. How sure are we that deterrence will actually hold? Are we really sure that Putin will refrain from using nuclear weapons? Can we be sure that anyone else will never use them? The Canadian government apparently can. Dear senators and members of parliament, I think it's actually now time to shift the paradigm, shift away from this ideology promoting nuclear deterrence and to allow for a meaningful dialogue on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and how these weapons do actually not make the world safer. I think there's no better way to understand the truth about nuclear weapons than from the people that survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and from those like Aigerim who share their personal fate from nuclear weapons testing. In 2 weeks, the Nobel Peace Prize 2024 will be awarded to Nihon Hidankyo, the Japanese Confederation of Nuclear Weapons Survivors. And they played a key role in educating about the humanitarian catastrophe of nuclear war. TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, translates their legacy into international law. And this treaty represents this shift in paradigm from abstract language of military strategies to the concrete reality of human suffering. Now we have 98 states on board of that treaty, more joining in the next weeks. And so the TPNW is still gaining momentum. By the end of this year, we hope that the majority of the world's countries will have signed or ratified that treaty. And Canada's response to this has been, again, nothing. Members of Parliament, the time for complacency is over. The world needs your leadership, and Canada needs to participate in this change. Canada should, of course, sign and ratify the TPNW. In the meantime, the government should at least send an official observer delegation to the conferences of this treaty, as many other countries, including other NATO allies, are doing. At the very least, Canada should not pretend to ignore this treaty. And as parliamentarians from the Senate and from the House of Commons, I urge you to embrace this process by introducing respective resolutions to get the government to do this step, get the government to join the conference of this treaty. Of course, you can make your personal support for the treaty public by, for example, signing the ICAN parliamentary pledge, as many of you have done. You can join thereby a global network of legislators that are in support of the treaty. You can also create a parliamentary group that deals specifically with humanitarian disarmament, and of course, specifically the TPNW. And I'm also here to extend an invitation to all of you to join us at the meeting of states parties to the TPNW in March, where again, ICAN will host a specific event for parliamentarians. So my conclusion is short. On the one hand, the geopolitical reality makes the risks and the danger of nuclear weapons very obvious. On the other hand, we have a solution. There's a treaty that's been negotiated, it's entered into force, it has the support of the vast majority of countries, and it's time that Canada stops ignoring both of these sides. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to discuss.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Florian. Well, that certainly, puts the cat among the pigeons, as it were, in terms of, we either do something or we don't do something. And I just want to add that, IPPNW is a civil society organization. We want to help. We want to be part of the solutions. We don't take a partisan. This is something that involves the health of everybody, both in Canada and on the planet. And we would wish to have both a relationship ongoing with parliamentarians to assist with this and work together in a way that will be useful. With that in mind, unfortunately, Dr. Hedy Fry is not able to join us. Technology has beaten us, but we do have an able substitute, Dr. McPhedran, or not doctor, but Senator McPhedran. Are you doctor as well?
Yes, but
it's okay. Dr. Senator McPhedran is going to step in and share with you some of the concerns and perspectives that Dr. Fry was planning on doing. So please welcome Senator McPhedran.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guilfoyle. And I want to express my regret that Dr. Fry was not able to connect with us through technology, because her leadership for many years now within Parliament, particularly in her role as a gender advisor for the OSCE, has been crucial to much of Canada's profile internationally. She has also been very involved with the parliamentary organization that has focused, I would say, primarily on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And many of us who are more recent to Parliament have much to thank her for her leadership. And one example of that leadership is a resolution that she brought to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the 30th annual session, which was hosted by Canada in Vancouver in July of 2023. I know that Senator Moodie and I were able to be there, and I'm just checking whether any of the other parliamentarians we have online with us. I think it's also very important to thank Senator Gigi Osler and also Member of Parliament Leah Taylor-Roy for being online with us this morning. It's a short resolution, but one of the reasons that we had asked Dr. Fry to join us, and give us a bit of the background of the diplomacy involved in actually reaching this resolution, not only being tabled, but adopted, was that, and I was there for her speech, and Dr. Fry made a very powerful argument for the need to understand the complementarity of the two major treaties in this area. And one of the reasons I think that it was necessary to make that point is that, unfortunately, as humans often tend to do, we have seen some divergence where certain groupings within parliaments are focused more on the NPT. And of course, we know that Canada as a government focuses at this point exclusively on the NPT, whereas many of us, including many of the parliamentarians here for this seminar, feel quite strongly that it's the new treaty and the growing support worldwide for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, where there needs to be a real investment of time and energy and commitment. And the resolution that I'm about to read to you was Dr. Fry's way of bringing these together, and it received widespread support at the OSCE. So it's Resolution 39, and I'm going to read it word for word. It's not that long. Calls for an immediate end to escalation of the nuclear threat fueled by the Russian Federation's war against Ukraine, and encourages all OSCE participating states to redouble international efforts to achieve the global elimination of nuclear weapons within a time-bound framework, including by negotiating a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention or framework of agreements as recommended in the final document of the 8th Review Conference of the Parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or by signing and ratifying the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I think this resolution very clearly demonstrates the complementarity of these treaties and reinforces the pathway that many parliamentarians are choosing to support and work with both of them. It ties in also in a very important way to the opportunity that Canadian parliamentarians on an individual basis, not having to wait for any permission from the Government of Canada, to decide to go to New York to participate in the third meeting of the states parties, reviewing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And now that I have focused on parliamentarians, I'd like to open the floor to those that are with us. And my first, the lead discussant
I have to say I have to go to committee. I'm so sorry, Senator McPhedran. I just got note that the clause by clause on Bill C-61, my amendment's coming up in minutes. So against my expectations, I have to run.
Okay, well, life of a parliamentarian. We appreciate you being here, and we're sorry we didn't get a chance to hear your comments. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Dr. Jacek.
Thank you so much, Senator McPhedran, and just a delight to be here to hear the conversation. And I think, Marilou, you did ask that I kind of summarize very briefly what we've heard from each of the participants so far this morning. Marilou and I go back several decades, just so you know, and she always tries to give me these difficult tasks. But in all seriousness, Dr. Guilfoyle, you started off by describing the problem. You used the term, we've diagnosed the problem. And you made it very clear that we need a treatment, and the ultimate goal is disarmament. Dr. Helfand, you reminded us of the dreadful possibilities, total destruction. It was a real reality check, I think, just to remind us all of what this could actually mean for not only our species, but of course the world as a whole. I thought it was extremely interesting also to hear from Aigerim in terms of what low dose radiation means, in terms of what she and her family have experienced. It wasn't
abstract. This was very concrete. Those of us who are physicians could identify with everything that she was talking about. And so I think that was extremely powerful. It was so great to hear from Leah, the energy of the youth, the impact particularly on women and girls. As we know, that often the medical experiences of women and girls is different from those of men, and in this particular case, even more alarming. Dr. Covington, you gave us some history in terms of Canada's role. Obviously, a certain amount of disappointment at this point in time. You focused on the need for us to re-energize the disarmament movement. And you asked for new leadership here in Canada. Dr. Fry, of course, we have just heard the resolution from 2023. I will admit I was completely oblivious to this momentous resolution, because if I had known, I would have been obviously very much supportive of that. However, that's the life of a parliamentarian. Florian Eblenkamp, thank you for your very direct request. You have detailed for us the current geopolitical reality, the urgency that simply promoting deterrence has in fact just simply created an arms race, and in fact the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And so there's a need for really meaningful dialogue, and obviously the need for Canada's participation in terms of both the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and also potentially signing on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So Marilou, I hope I've managed to summarize, and I'm sure I'll just hand it back to Dr. Guilfoyle to moderate the discussion.
Much. That was, I think, very helpful because it sets the stage for other questions and comments by the members of Parliament that are with us, and also Senator Osler. I'm hoping that you're still online, and I want to ask both Senator Osler and also MP Leah Taylor-Roy, if either one of you wish to be recognized at this point, you could indicate. And if so, if you could come on camera.
Oh, good morning. It's Senator Osler. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
I'm just in the middle of something, so I won't turn on my camera, but I wanted to thank everyone for this sobering session this morning. I'll confess it. I'm old enough that it gave me flashbacks to growing up in the 1980s. And I had the distinct pleasure of meeting Mary Wynne a few years ago before she passed. And so thank you for this. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion, although I may have to hop off to another meeting shortly after 10. But I would be very interested to hear everyone's thoughts on where do we go from here, not just as parliamentarians, but how to have this discussion with individuals, with Canadians, to really bring this threat back into focus, because I fear as a populace, we are preoccupied with other things, whether they're real or not, but how to restart this conversation with folks outside the room, outside of Parliament Hill. But once again, thank you very much for everything.
Thank you very much. I think MP Taylor-Roy had to leave, as is often the case, and I know that we have time ticking also for Member of Parliament Heather McPherson and Lisa Marie Barron. I'm wondering, Heather, if you'd like to speak. Yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for everyone who is here. Thank you for your words. It really gives me a lot of hope when I see young people at the table. It's very, very important. The movement needs to have your voice, and both you and our speaker that we had that joined us online I really, really appreciate it. So thank you very much. I was late today actually because I was meeting with the speaker from Ukraine, the speaker of the Parliament of Ukraine, and I want to say that, Florian, your comments on the global context is very, very important. You know, we have a Trump presidency, which as a New Democrat, I can say I'm appalled by. There are a number of things happening in the world, like what we saw out of Russia recently, that are absolutely terrifying. And I'm going to be very blunt, and I hope you'll forgive me. But frankly, we are now looking at a scenario in Canada, if the polls are right, where we are going to have a conservative government. There is no conservative member of parliament here, and there never is at these tables. However, the Liberal government has a moment in time right now to actually take some action. And I will just point out that the Liberal government did run, the Liberal Party did run on a nuclear disarmament place. And we have had the ability to move on the TPNW. There is absolutely no reason why there is not an observer mission from Canada. We know that NATO observation missions, NATO countries have been there, have observed. I have participated. I know Marilou has participated. We've had other members. Elizabeth has been there. There is no reason why Canada shouldn't be there. Lisa Marie is one of our newest MPs, and she is taking on this mantle, and I know will be hopefully at the meeting in March. And I think we'll be also advocating within the House with me as we go forward. But for me, I can't help but think that we are at the end of this Parliament. We are at a very, very pivotal moment in time. It is not likely that the Parliament will look the same when it comes back after the next election. It is a moment where the Liberal Party could take some real leadership, and I would urge those. I know you're the only one here. I'm sorry. But I would urge the government to really consider the steps that could be taken right now before the next election, because I don't see a path whereby Pierre Poilievre has any interest in nuclear disarmament. So we are running out of time. To make the conversation more sobering. Sorry, Marilou.
Thank you. I do want to, before turning the mic over to Member of Parliament Barron, I wanted to just note that we actually did have positive response from James Bazan. And last year, when we co-hosted the first Youth Parliament Nuclear Summit, he also attended part of that. But well, I don't have a party affiliation, so I can look at this more from a connective way. Your points are well taken, nevertheless. Member of Parliament Lisa Marie Barron, please.
Well, thank you so much, Senator, and thank you to all those who made today happen. It's just such an honor to be here and to hear from each of you. You know, this is an issue that when I first ran for the position of Member of Parliament, it was, I will admit, a fairly new issue to me. I shouldn't say new, I should say it felt many layers of disconnect between the day-to-day work that I was doing. And so I really appreciate the mentorship and the leadership from around this table to show people who are in our communities who may feel disconnected why this is important, to discuss the realities of and implications of this. It is so important that we're looking at also the impacts of nuclear testing. That is another area that, of course, I have not been fully I just never had that full information. And so as somebody who's coming into this fairly new, I am thankful for all of your wisdom that you're bringing here today. And I am just thinking about the ways that I can get involved, because, you know, we can talk about the history, which I think is important, of what has happened to date. I think often patterns of behavior are important for us to recognize so that we can do differently. And so, you know, I will appreciate the comments from Senator McPhedran around the fact that we have seen a Conservative at the table. My hope is that all members of Parliament will put partisanship to the side, because I agree so much with my colleague, MP McPherson, that now is the time that we have to be able to see some tangible actions being put into place. and to be able to see that foundation put into place for a better future for the next parliament when it does happen, regardless of what the outcome of the election is. And so I want to say thank you. I'm thinking about ways that I can show actions. I have a statement coming up on Friday. I'm hoping I can do some acknowledgements of the work that's being done here. And I will commit, of course, to talking to my constituents, but I will work alongside you to see that actions are moving forward. And want to thank you all for all of your work.
Thank you so much. I just would like to add just an overview from a physician's point of view. I mean, it's obvious this is the worst symptom of a global problem, which is that we are committed to use violence to solve conflict. We're actually committed to kill ourselves. We have a mutual suicide pact, which has got to be, to use a lay term, crazy. And we've been doing this for now decades. And we're actually worse off now than we probably were even at the height of the Cold War in terms of the degree of tension that exists in the world and the number of conflicts. You know, violence to solve conflict is actually increasing and has been over the last 10 or 15 years. So the point I want to make is it's so important for the parliamentarians to grasp what we have, the TPNW, and say, let us run with that and make sure that it achieves what it should do. But it is just a symptom. The disease is much deeper. And that is something where I think we have to, as Einstein said, the only thing that hasn't changed with the splitting of the atom has been our way of thinking. And thus we drift toward unparalleled disaster. And the way of thinking is that we somehow have to move beyond the current geopolitical impasses and this fighting over resources, which has caused what we have now. We call it a climate crisis, but it isn't. It's actually, we have overshot the planet's capacity to support us. That's the crisis. It isn't the climate. The climate is just a symptom. And this is something is going to require a way of thinking and a level of collaboration that is unprecedented. And we can't do that unless we begin to collaborate in ways across divisions, which we've never done. So
thank you so much. I'd like to go back to one of the comments that was made by Senator Osler, where she was asking for some more specific discussion about actions that can be taken. I just want to recommend this document that is available as a PDF, but it was also given to everybody in the room. And it looks back and looks forward and notes the conference at the third meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We have some considerable background here in that a number of parliamentarians, Elizabeth May, Heather McPherson, myself, Don Davies, we all made the choice at the second meeting of states parties, which was also in New York, also at UN headquarters. And last November, as we are entitled to do, we made the decision to use our resources and to travel as individual parliamentarians to participate in the second meeting of the states parties, and in particular to attend the ICAN parliamentarians for the TPNW, for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I will say this, and I will then invite Heather if she has more to add. We did this after months of conversation with Global Affairs Canada. Personal conversations that each of us had with the parliamentary secretary, with the minister herself. And I think it's fair to say that it was quite last minute when we were told that indeed Canada was again deciding to do nothing. And so we are faced again with a scenario where we will continue to engage in dialogue with Global Affairs Canada about the third meeting of states parties, which will be March 1st to the 3rd at UN headquarters in New York. And we will continue as individual parliamentarians to look at ways in which nevertheless Canada can be represented if we choose to go on an individual basis. I've already made that choice. I've already booked my travel. I absolutely will be there for the March 3rd meeting. And I want to give that as one specific action that parliamentarians, a number of parliamentarians, and I know I've had expressions of interest as a result of this seminar, where parliamentarians have been writing to say, okay, I'm interested in March 3rd. And so it may turn out that although Canada may choose to continue to do nothing, and shame on Canada for that, but parliamentarians will make a different choice. Many parliamentarians will choose to be there and in our own way do our best to engage as Canadians in this crucial aspect of trying to move the world towards a safer future. I don't know, Heather, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I think the only thing I would add is just a caution. You know, as much as I think all parliamentarians want to be there, we are not all senators that have the luxury of not being in an election at that moment in time. So I do think we should be aware as well that there are limitations. We don't know in this minority government. We know there's an election before October, but we don't know when, and it could very well be then. So we do have to be a little bit cautious about that. I think that said, it's very easy for us to continue to push the government to send an observation delegation. And in fact, that would be a very good message for Global Affairs Canada to send now, a signal to send now. Because I agree with you, Marilou, is that what we saw in the past is that the government doesn't say yes or no. They simply act in a state of stasis and don't say anything. There is no response to our calls. So, you know, rather than say we don't support this, they just do nothing. You know, a little bit, for me, it was always a little bit like a rabbit. Like if we stay really still, nobody will be watching us. But we will continue to be watching and to be pushing.
And there are two other practical points that I want to make here in terms of action, and the probably the most important is that parliamentarians are going to come together again, as we did in November of last year, and we are co-hosting again a Youth Parliament Nuclear Summit. And that will happen February 12th, 13th, and 14th. And there's fundraising that's already underway in communities far away from us, particularly my home province of Manitoba, where young people are determined to come here to Parliament Hill and participate in direct dialogue with parliamentarians. And that last year was our first. February 2025 will be our second, and it becomes an opportunity for young people who are very seldom invited to participate in our committee processes, in the various formal parliamentary processes. They're very seldom the witnesses, they're very seldom recognized as experts. And this is one way in which we as parliamentarians are coming together to create that direct dialogue.
Yes,
we've got Florian.
Florian. Just I let Florian. This is so important what Mary Wynne is talking about, because where I was going with my remarks is education has to be the central piece of this, and providing fora like this is so important. Florian.
I was going to say a similar argument. We after today we're going to Toronto for a public debate, first in the university, and then 2 other events on Friday and Saturday. And we found that actually there's an incredibly huge interest in these kinds of discussions. Maybe because there's a lack of these discussions and it simply don't take place so much. Maybe because no one feels responsible for hosting those. But the experience from just a few weeks of organizing an event has been that tickets sell out overnight. But there's such an engaged civil society, many of them ICAN partner organizations like IPPNW and others who are just waiting, it feels like, to talk about this and bring this to a public forum. So speaking of elections, that means there will be public debates on all sorts of policy issues, and maybe the upcoming election is one of the rare occasions to actually talk about foreign policy as well. And then why not about Canada's lack of leadership on nuclear weapons? My other point was that, of course, an election also means that parties and individual members of parliament need to take a stand. And so we would certainly expect Canadian parties to include the TPNW in their party platforms, make it very clear that you want the government to join this treaty. That will make it easier for the time after, either if you're in government or not. But the more clear and more explicit you are about the intention to join this treaty before the election, the less you'll be under pressure to retreat from that promise afterwards. So my offer is to team up, to organize as many public debates, be it online or actually in person, as possible. There's ample expertise in Canadian civil society and Parliament to host this, and I think it's merely a matter of getting started.
Absolutely. Leah, please.
Yes, well, thank you once again, Member of Parliament, parliamentarians, for your remarks and participation. Echoing what Florian said, it could be seen as future-proofing to announce intention, to announce for attendance at the meeting of state parties for the TPNW, both from any political party. In addition, if you are unable to attend but are still wanting to be a part of championing these issues, us as civil society welcome any way we can support you, whether it's more dialogues like this, putting you in touch with experts that fit the niche of what you need to discuss, whether education, research, or action points, policy recommendations. We're here, we're your allies in this, and we appreciate the leadership you're taking. I think more meetings like this are one actionable item. I know your time is precious. We appreciate you being here today. If you're interested in doing something similar like this in advance of the MSP, the third meeting of state parties around the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit, or in advance or afterwards, we're here. In addition, one of our recommendations is to say congratulations to the organization that won the Nobel Peace Prize. We have the Nobel Peace Prize in the room with us today, and if you want to take photos with it or take a video with it to say congratulations, we're happy. We've got camera equipment to send that to your office, and you could also take the time to also call on Canada to sign and join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Paulina and I over here are also available in Ottawa to meet to discuss any further actions you can take as an individual parliamentarian. But those are a few. I know former parliamentarians, such as the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy, has also explicitly expressed that if a parliamentarian group were to form, that him as well as Doug Roche and many other honorable former parliamentarians would be keen to provide any expertise or advice in the process as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to go to Zoom to Kazakhstan. I think Aigerim is wanting to add something.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to add on different actions as well. And considering uranium mining and the impact on Indigenous communities of Canada, I also wanted to focus on the nuclear justice part, which is a pathway to nuclear disarmament as well. And if Canada becomes an observer state at the third MSP, the International Trust Fund will be negotiated and by the Kazakhstan and Kiribati governments. And I think that in order to be a part of the trust fund, the government doesn't have to be a party to the TPNW, which of course would be amazing if Canada will be a part of TPNW, of course, but also considering that Canada has feminist international assistance policy, as well as Germany has feminist foreign policy. And for example, Germany in 2023, in March, they committed they adopted guidelines of feminist foreign policy. And in these guidelines, they committed themselves, and I quote, to support efforts to recognize and compensate victims of nuclear tests. So following the history of Canada and the impact of uranium mining on Indigenous peoples, I think that it's important that this feminist international assistance policy, and including the participation as an observer state at the 3 MSP to TPNW, would be one of the steps of action to contribute to nuclear justice, to contribute to pathways of reflecting of different colonial legacies as well. So Thank you. I hope I hope I was clear. Thank you very much.
That is so clear. Thank you so much, Aigerim. Really, that's so important. Thank you. So I think we're drawing toward the end of our time. Sorry, Ira, quick comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit about the special role that I think Canada has in this situation. Ultimately, the decision to eliminate nuclear weapons or not is going to be made by the 8-9 countries that have them. But these countries aren't doing very well in this project. They are totally oblivious to the danger they are running for the entire world. And it's really important for the countries which have influence on the nuclear nine to use that influence. The United States is probably the country which is most likely among the 9 to make a break in the right direction. Not that it's terribly likely, but it's pivotal and it has something more of an open political system than, say, Russia or China. But it needs help. The people in the United States who are trying to bring about change in U.S. nuclear policy. And Canada is America's closest friend. I was talking with John yesterday. There's an expression in America, friends don't let friends drive drunk. I think in the international arena, friends don't let countries have nuclear weapons. And Canada really has a responsibility because of the position that it's in to provide real powerful leadership to the global effort to bring about this. And it shouldn't be seen as sort of an off issue, off to the side of the main business that Canada is attending to. The data that I presented before about what's going to happen if there's a nuclear war, most people don't know that. And we need to get that information out here in Canada and globally. And then Canada has to step up and do the right thing.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. But to close, I'd like to call on Dr. Ravalia, Senator Ravalia, Dr. Ravalia from Newfoundland, a family physician and who has been a long-time public health advocate. But I'd also like to thank Dr. Ravalia and Dr. Moodie as well for their leadership, because this wouldn't have happened without their coming to a Zoom conference well, it was Zoom for me, not for Dr. Ravalia and Dr. Moodie, that set this up. So I would like you to welcome Dr. Ravalia and his leadership in this whole realm. Dr. Ravalia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. Thank you, colleagues, esteemed speakers and guests. And in particular, I'd like to welcome our staff as well. I think for me in particular, Senator McPhedran has been an inspiration in this regard. And I thank you for the tremendous work you've done through many, many years. A few takeaways resonate profoundly for me from today's meeting. The devastating health consequences of nuclear weapons, including long-term radiation exposure, disproportionate impacts on women, children, and indigenous communities, and the global ramifications of even limited nuclear exchanges underline, I think, the urgency of disarmament for all of us. These are not merely political or security issues. From my perspective, this is a public health crisis waiting to happen. Although we do not possess nuclear weapons, our historical involvement in Canada in uranium mining and nuclear reactor technology places us at the nexus of responsibility and opportunity. We need to strongly support the TPNW. We must ask ourselves, how can Canada reclaim its leadership in disarmament while balancing its strategic alliances? The intersection of nuclear weapons, climate change, and public health creates a moral imperative to act, and the resource allocated to nuclear arsenals could instead address pressing global health and environmental needs. So I look forward to this ongoing dialogue. I thank you for your participation, in particular for those of you who have traveled long distances to be with us and enrich us with your discussions today. So let's continue the challenge and let's look forward to the path ahead of a nuclear-free world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ravalia. Dr. Ravalia made a very important point that I wanted to close on, and that is to thank our teams, the people that work with us in our offices that truly make this possible. And we have in my office, interns. We run a parliamentary learning lab in my office, and we have with us interns from the University of Ottawa Law School, as well as our team, J.I. Anderson and also Donatan Brown. And I know that this is the case for every parliamentarian, that it's the teams that support us and facilitate our participation. So a big thank you for that. And Aigerim, I hope we get to see you. I hope you're coming on March for the meeting of the states parties, the third meeting. It'll be a great honor and a great pleasure to meet you in person, and really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You want to make a closing comment?
I would just like to say how extraordinary this event certainly has been for me. I've not had the privilege of being in a chamber with parliamentarians in this particular sort of venue and with this purpose, and it's heartening to have had the opportunity, number one, and it's heartening to have had the support and the acknowledgement and the support of Dr. Ravalia and Dr. Moodie, and the notion that really we're all in it together. We're creating hopefully something which we all have a vested interest in, and I really look forward to just working together to walking this pathway so that we can, achieve something that isn't just good for Canada, but really is good for humanity, because this is a global threat and increasingly things are linked, and therefore we have to have a world embracing vision, even though we may have narrower concerns and they're important, but yet we have to understand that it's all linked. And so it's really been extraordinary, and I would like to thank you each and every one, staff, everybody who's done all the legwork, and particularly Dr. and Senator McPhedran, who has been really a light shining the path forward, shining on the path forward.
Thank you, and we are adjourned.